Hi, I'm Steve, the host of the Tabletop Inventing podcast. Normally, our podcast theme music comes in at this point, and we hear that inspiring voice. This is the sixth and final episode in our powerful podcast series this December. Today, you'll hear Geoff Wiggs say,
it's like art teachers who've never been to Europe, who've never been to the Louvre, who've never been to the National Galleries in London. They put pictures of these paintings up, and you say, wow, that's a pretty painting. And then you go and you stand in front of it in the Louvre or in the National Gallery of London, and the scale and the brightness of the pigments and the brushstrokes, your ability to see the strokes of the brush on the canvas, it brings everything out. It changes everything. It goes from being a sterile picture. It's different when you see it full size. When you see a room devoted to a painting like the Mona Lisa, and the crowds of people that gather in front of that painting, it's an event. And the painting itself is so much more interesting than the pictures of that painting. The painting itself has a life that those pictures, regardless of their definition, can't bring forward. But you have to have a level of intellectual curiosity to hike to Paris, get into the Louvre, stand in line long enough to see this painting, and then you've also got to have a little bit of a soul to say, wow, that was really amazing. We don't have a vocabulary for it. But if you see it, and you pass on to the people you're teaching that there is something there that can't be conveyed by either my words or this video of it or this picture of it, then you spark a level of curiosity. And to me, that's the key to education.
Geoff is a big fan of experiential learning, as you'll hear more on today's interview. Strap yourself in, because Geoff doesn't pull any punches.
Do you dream of a classroom where learning is natural? Can we inspire students to lifelong learning? What exactly is the purpose of an education? Inspiring students to be curious, independent, creative, innovative, deep thinking, confident, proactive, collaborative, determined, educated. Rise to the challenge of changing the world. This is teaching. This is learning. This is who we are. Welcome to the Tabletop Inventing Podcast.
How does one start as a computer programmer and end up as a lawyer? How is a deeper perspective on history related to maker education? What is the difference between seeing the Mona Lisa on a website and seeing it in the Louvre? Stay tuned for today's podcast to hear the answers to these and other burning questions. Today's episode may be a little edgy and irreverent. This is a little bit of a listener advisory again, but I don't think any of us is surprised that a few students make it through the U.S. education system with some scars. Today's guest, Geoff Wiggs, is now a successful attorney in Northern California, but his experience is worth some tough reflection. So my guest today is Geoff Wiggs, and Geoff, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do?
Let's see, right now, in my fourth incarnation, I'm a generalist attorney in the Northern California area. I practice in bankruptcy and federal and state civil litigation, as well as trust and estates litigation. Prior to that, I was a management consultant, again, a solo management consultant. I'm a solo attorney. I was a solo management consultant for 2 years after receiving my MBA from Pepperdine. Prior to that, I spent 15 years as a computer programming contractor. Basically traveled around the country programming for wholesale food distribution operations in a specialized ERP or enterprise resource planning system. While before that was I spent a lot of time as a night computer systems operator working my way through school, and prior to that was the Air Force. And that's there were things before that, such as driving an ambulance and being a volunteer fireman, but those are the jobs that actually paid me money.
Wow, that's quite a litany. You have a pretty broad view of the American employment system.
Yes, I do, and the education system as well. It's I've been around, I guess.
So, a little bit about your educational experience. You can start wherever. You can start.
Well, I think what stands out is my time in high school in California as a in a public high school in California, trying to squeeze an education out of it. I think I missed in my senior year. I think in one or two classes I missed 60 out of 90 days in one semester. I still managed to graduate with a 3.97 GPA, 13th or so in my class of 500. Never learned how to work. Never learned how to apply myself. I walked out of high school with a full academic ride to the University of Tulsa as a petroleum engineering major, which lasted a grand total of about a month and a half before I realized that I had never learned how to actually do any real work and never learned how to actually apply myself academically. I was doomed from the moment I left high school.
Huh. That's interesting. Well, you managed to do okay for yourself. How did you go from that to where you are now?
Well, I was hanging around in Porterville, where we know each other from, basically, and I think it was my dad told me, had suggested that perhaps I look at the military, and I'd never really thought of the military as an option because I was supposed to be one of those smart kids, right? I was supposed to be able to do anything I wanted to, and a year at college had convinced me that I was kind of an idiot. I was supposed to be an engineering major. The only classes that I actually enjoyed and or passed were English, political science, and computer science. At the time, this is back in 1983. At the time, the whole computer science thing, it was very, very young in terms of what is in terms of the scope that it is today, and so it never really occurred to me to go and become a computer science major or a computer engineer, which I probably could have easily transitioned to at the time if I'd have had any level of guidance. After that, it was the Air Force, where instead of being an X-ray technician and getting to serve out my time in medical clinics around the country or around the world, I ended up taking a synthetic language test, and they discovered that I knew a lot about languages, or I had a natural talent for languages. So it was off to the Defense Language Institute for a year to learn Vietnamese. Not my language of choice. I actually wanted to learn Arabic and sell my soul to Coca-Cola at the time. But the Vietnamese language program was brutally tough, but my friends and I, we made it through, and it was an immersion program. I didn't do very well at it. I really wasn't ready to apply myself at the time. I'd coasted through so much school. I was identified as gifted in grade 4, and so I was put in all the gifted classes. Well, being in the gifted classes essentially meant that I could get away without doing any work. I think I wrote my first essay in my freshman year of high school, and was shocked and dismayed to discover that it was graded as an F. I still remember the F on the page. I had never gotten an F before in anything. And he was right. It was Tracy Armstrong. I still remember the professor. I actually have his book of poetry on my desk at home. But I had never had to actually do any work at learning. And that woke me up a little bit, but even in high school, those teachers were so few and far between that I didn't have to wake up that much. I could, instead of firing on one cylinder, I had to fire on 2 out of 6 cylinders, and that was more than enough to cruise through. A system that was basically there to warehouse juvenile delinquents so that they weren't walking the streets during the day, I guess. I've often jokingly called myself a victim of the California public education system. They were so overloaded with kids who just didn't want to be there that there was no way for them to teach anyone who had any level of intellectual curiosity. And I wasn't diligent enough, or I guess, I don't know if the word's diligent even, motivated enough to go out and learn it on my own. I'm fascinated by learning. I love to learn new things. In fact, being an attorney is the best job I've ever had, because every time I start a new case, I get to learn something completely new, even if it's a case related to something else that I've done over and over and over again. There's very little that is, other than a lot of administrative stuff below the surface. There's very little in law that is cookie cutter. There's a lot of the same forms, a lot of the same situations, but you've got to apply a reasonable level of learning and discovery to each individual case. That wasn't the case in high school. That level of curiosity wasn't rewarded. Conformity was rewarded. Being quiet was rewarded. I remember one of the girls in our class, a very nice gal, she was the co-valedictorian, and I don't think she'd ever taken an academic class. other than the bare minimum requirements. And that's nothing against her. She went to those classes. She got good grades, and she probably had a much more satisfying early post high school education or post secondary education career, or maybe even a happier life. But than I did after. Because it literally took me 10 years to learn that there was a point to it all, I guess. Does that make sense, Steve?
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. So did you start checking out around 4th grade, or is that just when you were kind of shifted into the gifted classes? About when did you realize that you could kind of get away with stuff and start coasting?
Junior high. Junior high, I realized that I took it. I remember. I think I remember the class. We had biology or zoology with one professor at Pioneer Junior High, and he gave us a test at the beginning of the year, and he gave us a test at the end of the year. Same test. And I aced the test, which is never a good thing to do. And so I basically sat back and said, well, and he told us, this is the test you're going to get at the end of the year, too. And I thought to myself, well, I guess I'm kind of done. So, and then I started noticing that I would be in these gifted English classes, gifted language classes, and it didn't really matter if I didn't do any work. No one seemed to be all that interested in holding my feet to the fire or expecting any level of performance from me. I was bright. I participated in class. I stayed up on the reading. I did the homework kinda, but I wasn't putting out any effort. I think that what would have made a huge difference, I think, is something that I saw of my high school friends do. And her senior year, instead of going to high school, she went to junior college. She went over to Porterville Junior College, and she took a full load of class there instead of hanging around the high school and marking time until the end of the year. I think that might have made a huge difference, but no one was pushing me that way. I don't know what, my parents weren't pushing me that way. I didn't even realize it was a possibility till probably mid-year, and it seemed like work, so I wasn't going to do it to myself. So I did a lot of work avoidance. Consequently, I spent 10 years of post-secondary education getting my undergraduate degree. When I finally graduated with my degree in computer science, I had 170 semester hours.
Wow.
And that's what it took to finally get a degree in something. It caused its own damage, right? I got my bachelor's degree just in time for my 10-year reunion, literally a month and a half prior to my 10-year reunion.
So normally at this point in the conversation, I'm asking something about Google and the internet and how students today can use that to make themselves look smarter. And maybe that's the right place to bring this up now. We've now got Wikipedia and Bing and Google and lots of places where we can just go look information up. And someone with the reasonably savvy ability to search can come up with just about any answer, and it's probably reasonably intelligent as long as there's a little bit of skill behind it. And so students can suddenly look like they are 10 to 20 IQ points smarter than they really are. In an environment like this, what does it mean to be educated now?
I think that's a big challenge. It seems to me, and again, I don't have any of the experience that the kids have now, but any relatively competent paraphraser can now take Wikipedia and Google and write an essay on it. And I think that it's a sacrifice of information for knowledge, learning. One of my favorite things to do when I was at the University of Nebraska and my computer science degree was to wander through the library and look for the oldest looking book on the shelf, on any given shelf. There wasn't much literature in computer science that made any sense because anything older than 6 months was out of date anyway. So why bother? Maybe you'd read a couple SSG magazines now and then just for fun. But they were random learning excursions, and I used to be able to do that on the internet. I think I used to do it a lot more than I do. But it seems now, if you're giving a student an assignment and you're sending them out to the internet, they're going out to the internet to help them accomplish that assignment. Number one, it's wonderful on one hand because you've got all the information in the world sitting there waiting for you, but you've also got no filter. You've got no way to evaluate how that information is skewed or whose point of view dictates the course of that information. And it doesn't even have to be a bias. There is an unconscious bias that any publisher of information is going to run across in what they choose to publish. it isn't so much how they choose to speak about what they're publishing, but what did they actually choose to publish? Right? What stories did they ignore, and what pieces of information did they ignore, and how many other sources are you going to have to go to find those pieces of information that were left out because the publisher or journalist producing that piece of information didn't like it, didn't think it was useful, or just didn't agree with it and left it out. And I think remember in the old days we'd pick up those, what was that index called that had all the magazine articles? It was in comprehensive. Remember that thing?
Yeah, I know what you're talking about. I mean, it was next to the card file or something.
Exactly. There were those big books, and they had like quarterly magazines, and you could open them up, and it would have magazine titles. Oh my God, I cannot convey to you how many times I would pick that thing up, find a random article, and launch into an entirely new area of discovery for myself, just reading something. And I love to read, so any excuse to find something new to read was all it took. I would just devour anything. But I don't know if you type a bunch of words into the Google search box and you hit enter, and it brings you back the information. Where is that exploration coming from? You're learning exactly what you need to know, but I don't know that what you needed to know was really the point of the exercise when we were kids, right? The point of the exercise was how do you go and learn something. Let's say I did a report when I was a kid on the Nez Perce Indians, because I had a whole bunch of horsemen's magazines that told the story of Chief Joseph and the Nez Perce Indians and how they ran away from the cavalry and their whole mapping route. And the point of that paper that I wrote on that subject wasn't to know the history intimately of that particular set of Indian battles or that particular crisis at that time. It was to put all that information together, evaluate it, make a decision about it, come to a conclusion or a judgment on my own, see one or two sides of that, maybe even three or four sides of that, and ask myself, what should have happened, what could have happened. Was it all bad? Was it all good? Did I learn something out of it? Now I would type that in, and someone would direct me to a webpage that said, here's this great Indian leader, and these are the things he did, and here's the horrible cavalry after him. It's too easy. Does that unnecessarily confuse the issue?
No, I don't think so. In fact, I think you're kind of heading in the direction of the next question I tend to like to ask people, and that is, given this landscape of your experience, what is the purpose of an education looking at all of that?
To me, it's to fill time between life and death. What do you do, right? You are born and you start learning stuff. So you keep learning and you keep practicing and you keep discovering new things. At least I do. I've left at least 2 careers where I was in relatively high demand. When I get bored and I have too much access to a computer system, then I get a little bit dangerous because I can make boredom leads to inattention, and attention leads to mistakes. Mistakes lead to large-scale businesses closing, people being out of work, people being out of jobs, and me getting sued for malpractice. I have to stay interested. I don't understand the mentality of people who can just grind stuff out day after day in a job that they're not interested in. I often think that my life would be easier if it were. Certainly would be easier if I could find a good 9-to-5 job or a 9-to-9 job, right? Wherein I was able to sit down, work a bunch, log my hours, and leave, and that was all that was really expected of me. I worked at Mutual of Omaha right after getting my computer science degree. I worked there for a little over a year, and I could have easily just put my head down and just kept working. They were wonderful people, but I came into the program right out of a computer science degree, and I was basically teaching them the language and the computer system that they were working on. They knew other systems, but they didn't know the one that they'd been placed on. I did, and it would have been no problem to just to stay with that. You guys had been there for 20 plus years, 20, 25, 30 years. Their greatest joy in life was to meet down in the Mutual of Omaha cafeteria at lunch and quiz each other on rules from the golf rule book. That was the part of their job that they liked, and that had nothing to do with their job. Their job itself, they just did it. They were tradesmen, right? They showed up when the whistle blew, and they went home when the whistle blew. And yeah, they'd put time in if they had to, but by and large, they didn't think about this stuff at home. I wake up at 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning, and I don't even realize I'm awake. I'm already thinking about my cases, and when I realize I'm awake, I'm usually mad at myself for not sleeping because I don't go to bed till midnight, and I'm up at 4 or 5 because my job is pulling me out of my bed and throwing me into my chair and chaining me to my desk every day, and I don't know how to do it any other way.
So I'm going to back up just a little bit. I think it's interesting when I asked you about the purpose of an education that you didn't say anything about school. You jumped straight into learning, which isn't necessarily connected to school. It can be, but it doesn't have to be, and that's an interesting perspective. Tell me why you immediately jumped to learning as its own activity.
I don't know that I saw a lot of value in school, other than it was almost like once I learned how to read, I was kind of self-directed. Even from my earliest memory, I was reading everything I possibly could get my hands on, and that's what if I had one thing to wish for everybody, that they would love to read anything. I mean, because I don't think sitting in a classroom, being drilled on names and dates. Well, let me bring this up. I'm a big history buff. So is my wife. We travel to Europe as often as we can, which isn't all that often, but we get there, and we love to see where these historical things occurred. Now, if I was to rely on the history that I learned in grade school, junior high, and high school, my history would be limited to some stuff about the Magna Carta, maybe, the Pilgrims hopping in a boat coming to Jamestown. This is out of sequence, but Columbus sailing around the world, and then all these Spanish explorers who sailed around the world or to America. I'm sorry, Columbus sailing to America, and claiming it for Spain. None of the actual tapestry of what occurred during those events ever came through, because we would get somewhere around the Civil War every year, and then we would stop because that was the end of the year. And then next year, history would start right back up at the same rough time period, and plow right along through until we got around to the Civil War again, and then we'd stop because that was the end of that year, and we did the same damn history year after year after year. Eventually, a little bit about California history and the Spanish selling of the missions, the Spanish, the takeover by the white settlers, maybe a little bit about Vallejo's desperate appeal for settlers or an army, but every year it stopped. And then it restarted again. And because we grew up in Porterville, once we started junior high, we started reading Grapes of Wrath and talking about the Okies coming out from Oklahoma and Arkansas, and the misery they had to go through. But that was it. We didn't talk much about World War I. I recently found a podcast on World War I that I've been just devouring. I had no idea of all the little political things that were going on that basically caused the entire world to erupt in flames. And then the same thing happening 20 years later in World War II. But I never got that from school. I took AP History. I passed the AP History test, but I didn't get much history out of it.
So I have a question about that. So when exactly was it that you noticed that history was less about facts and dates and more about stories and interpretations?
When I was in high school, I took the AP History exam, and on the AP History exam, there was a big picture of who I now know is John Brown, and the question asked us to discuss the northern and southern side's view of the story of John Brown. Now, wonder of wonders, I had never heard of John Brown. I had heard of Harper's Ferry, and I vaguely knew that something had occurred there, but I couldn't have told you who John Brown was, and I had never seen the picture before. So I commenced, as all good test takers do, to bullshitting. And 3 pages later, lo and behold, I passed an AP History exam, which meant I didn't have to take first semester history in college. And it had nothing to do with the dates. It had nothing to do with the numbers. It had nothing to do with anything about the details of it. I was able to deduce that it was something about the Civil War. There were enough leading questions that it pointed me towards Harper's Ferry, and I talked about it generically in a manner that evidently either pleased or fooled whatever sleepy-eyed grader was dealing with my essay that day, to whom I'm eternally grateful as well as eternally sincerely apologetic for having to read my garbage. I remember in school we would start sometime around 1420, the year 1420 plus or minus, when Degas sailed around the Horn of Africa. We finally found a way to the Indian Ocean, and how the Portuguese explorers sailed further and further. And oddly enough, we never knew that they were actually. We were never taught that they were sailing down there to build the slave trade. No one ever bothered to mention that. So they gave us a bunch of years, which I've forgotten, and I don't think I ever actually memorized, because memorization takes work. And as I've told you before, I'm not big on work. I'm not a big fan. At least not that kind of work, not that mindless sort of memorization. And every year we'd get somewhere near the Civil War in history class. And then the year would end, and we'd come back and we'd start the whole stupid thing again. Pretty much the same period of time, maybe a little more detailed because we were older. And then every year we'd get right up to the Civil War again. And then we'd stop. And that was it. That was history. We had this weird sort of 400-year period of time. It basically repeated the same thing. And then when we got to junior high, we learned about the Grapes of Wrath period, because we all grew up in Porterville, California, where the Grapes of Wrath basically ended. The book ended. And so we learned about that. But everything was learned in isolation. Nothing about causes. And when I started getting out and visiting some of these places, and I started realizing that the other side had a point of view as well. So, in America we tend to be gross narcissists in terms of everything. All history is either seen or told from our point of view, and I think that's one of the reasons. Because we're sitting in these history classes as kids, and everything is taught from an American point of view. And I've learned so much more since then about how other countries viewed us as we were coming up back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, that we were the upstarts that were taking on Spain and beginning to project power through our navy. I don't know. It seems like history is taught by partially interested physical ed teachers that neither know nor care about why these events occurred. I guess it's a rambling answer. I'm not even sure that I addressed your point, but my uncle Bill, who I love dearly, was a history major. After he got back from Vietnam, he attended college on the GI Bill, majored in history, and then went out to teach school. And he's got a real wry sense of humor. And one day he said something about history major, and he goes, how dull of a person do you have to be a history major? And he's actually one of the more interesting people I know in my family. And it was several years before I actually learned that he was a history major. But he has a more informed and more mature view of the world, and I think that's what history is supposed to be giving us. But the people that teach it seem so disinterested, at least in the high school and junior high, elementary school level. They just seem so disinterested in telling the story. I think that in order to tell the story, in order to understand the stories behind all those dates and numbers, you have to be genuinely interested in it. Otherwise, you never dig below the surface of that. And I don't think most public school teachers are digging that deep. And I don't blame them. I mean, they're dealing with a bunch of kids who have no interest at all in being there. Their parents aren't enforcing their attendance. They're attending because that's the law and that's what they're supposed to do. They're not there because they want to be. They're there because they have to be. Does that answer that question, or is that just too long?
No, I think that answers that question, and I think you've hit it, actually, the core of probably most or all of the disciplines that are out there. You have to have a genuine interest in the study in order for it to be valuable to you. And I think for us, I mean, at Tabletop Inventing, we spend time thinking about science, technology, engineering, art, mathematics, and occasionally entrepreneurship. Not that history is unimportant, and not that some of the other social sciences are unimportant. That just happens to be what we're focusing on. But my experience has been that the students that are putting their hands on the material, that are really experimenting with it, rolling it around in their heads, touching the electronics and the programming and the 3D design, are the ones that are doing the most learning, and just talking to them doesn't seem to that doesn't seem to pique their interest, and so no real learning seems to happen. And from the history perspective, what you're talking about, it seems to be the same analogy, where the history to you became real and interesting when you started connecting some things that you were genuinely interested to know to dates and ideas and places that before seemed more or less disconnected. Is that?
Yeah, if you think about it, it's really easy for an elementary or grade school or junior high or high school teacher to write a test based on dates, right? Give me the date that Ferdinand de Gama sailed around the Horn of Africa. What year did he come back? What year did he leave? When did Columbus sail across the Atlantic? Those are easy tests to grade, right? You write the question down. The student writes 1492 and for 1492, and you know that the student at least paid attention to the text enough to memorize that year. But when you put that same voyage in the context of why did Ferdinand and Isabella sponsor nominal Italian, ostensible Portuguese sailor during the middle of their prosecution of the Inquisition, why did they sponsor his voyage seeking India when all of the navigators in Europe knew that Columbus wasn't good enough at math to know how to measure the circumference of a globe or of a ball of a sphere? You look at the desperation for trade, the desperation to get around the stranglehold that Portugal had on trade. Those stories are interesting, right? But those stories also involve interpretation and understanding and intellectual curiosity. And if you don't have those three factors, you're not going to find somebody interested enough to figure all that stuff out. And if you only start your history lesson in the 1400s, you don't really understand that. You never talk about how Portugal, this little tiny country on the lip of Spain, had a stranglehold and a massive empire. It's like art teachers who've never been to Europe, who've never been to the Louvre, who've never been to the National Galleries in London. They put pictures of these paintings up, and you say, "Wow, that's a pretty painting." And then you go and you stand in front of it in the Louvre or in the National Gallery of London, and the scale and the brightness of the pigments and the brushstrokes, your ability to see the strokes of the brush on the canvas, it brings everything out. It changes everything. It goes from being a sterile picture, even in HD, which is what we see on the web all the time, in HD that would have left our ancestors envious. It's different when you see it full size. When you see a room devoted to a painting like the Mona Lisa, and the crowds of people that gather in front of that painting, it's an event. And the painting itself is so much more interesting than the pictures of that painting. The painting itself has a life that those pictures, regardless of their definition, can't bring forward. But you have to have a level of intellectual curiosity to hike to Paris, get into the Louvre, stand in line long enough to see this painting, and then you've also got to have a little bit of a soul to say, wow, that was really amazing. I don't know anything about that painting, but it was amazing. And look at the way it looks. I've stood in the Sistine Chapel and looked at the restored ceiling, thinking, this is amazing. There are no words for it. We can't describe what that ceiling looks like in real words. We don't have a vocabulary for it. But if you see it, and you pass on to the people you're teaching that there is something there that can't be conveyed by either my words or this video of it or this picture of it, then you spark a level of curiosity. And to me, that's the key to education. I've got 170 credit hours because I just kept finding new things that I wanted to learn. I had an advisor yell at me once because I took a C++ class. She said, "Well, I hope you wanted to learn that because it's not going to count for your degree. You've already got too many programming languages." Are you kidding me? I've got too many programming languages? I couldn't have enough programming languages. I love programming languages. I used to collect them like baseball cards. and use them and work with them and understand the strengths and weaknesses of them. But because those are the languages I was interested in. Computers and computer science wasn't just a career path. It was something that I was genuinely interested in, and it sparked a level of intellectual curiosity. And I worry that kids don't get that anymore. They don't, because okay, I'm intellectually curious about X, so I'm going to go to Google and I'm going to search X, and it's going to tell me all I need to know. And because we've kind of started treating the internet as this comprehensive, not infallible, but at least comprehensive source, where's that curiosity going to come from? You know, is an HD JPEG or GIF or TIFF file of a master's painting the same as seeing it in gallery? You know, any of the Van Gogh paintings, you know, the pictures of those don't do them justice. When you see them hanging on a wall, it's an experience. It's not just a picture. And I worry that we're showing people a lot of pictures.
If you say much more, I'm going to have to put you on the payroll, because everything you're talking about is exactly the things that we keep trying to emphasize. You know, the importance of curiosity, the importance of actually rolling up your sleeves and jumping headfirst into what you're trying to learn. It isn't enough just to read a description in a textbook. You know, you have to experience the education, whether it is history or art or science or engineering or, you know, computer programming. You have to roll up your sleeves and go do it. There's no substitute. And I think if I let you and you let me, we would probably go on with this interview for quite a bit longer. So I'm going to cut things short here and just ask you for any final thoughts, and we'll wrap it up.
Final thoughts. Wow. You know, education is work. It's hard work to get an education. It's supposed to be. Humans are not instinctual beings, right? There's so much that we learn on instinct and habit and force of habit, but the things that really separate us from the monkeys are things that we're willing to work to go do. We're willing to work to discover. I am frequently standing on a soapbox mourning the demise of our space program, because it was a lot of money spent, but it was money spent looking up. And there are people who argue with me saying that that money should all be spent on social programs. And I keep thinking to myself, spending it on social programs is spending it all looking down, trying to lift people up, rather than setting a goal out there that's greater than all of us and trying to get people to all work towards that goal. We can subsidize social behavior all day long, and it's not going to advance us. But when we subsidize knowledge and education and risk and seeking and striving, then we get a true societal advantage from it. Caring for others is nice, but as a governmental function, I don't think it really advances a republic or a society to do so.
Well, it's interesting you tied that back to a previous podcast. You didn't know you did that, but a few podcasts back, Linda Poland talked about hearing, you know, the declaration that we're going to put a man on the moon. I mean, that's inspiring. I think in our generation, the equivalent would be to put a space station on Mars, and I don't think it's outside the realm of possibility. But you're right, we have to get behind it. We have to look up. You know, we're going to have to get our hands dirty, and we're going to have to go give it a shot. Thank you so much, Geoff. I really appreciate your insights here, and I just wanted to thank you so much for taking a few minutes to talk to us and give us a perspective of a lawyer, computer programmer, art enthusiast, slash history buff, slash probably 4 or 5 other things.
I think academic vagrant is probably...
Yes. I'll be looking forward perhaps to talking to you more about this in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. It's been a privilege. Thank you.
Geoff is a lot of fun. I think I enjoy talking to him because he's always curious and has unusual perspectives on life. Curiosity is one of those traits that rarely follows us from childhood to adulthood. But those who manage to keep it intact as they mature seem to have a much more interesting life. If you want to give your teenager an opportunity to find that level of curiosity and drive to discovery, you need to know about the Resonance Innovation Fellowship. This next year, we'll be taking a select group of 10 to 15 teens on a journey of self-discovery, deep intellectual curiosity, and innovation leadership. This is not a club or a social gathering or homework tutoring. The students in the Resonance Innovation Fellowship will be on a quest to find impact and world change through the backdrop of technology. To find out more, email me at stevecurdy@ttinvent.com. That's STEVEKURTI@ttinvent.com. Don't wonder about the future. Email us, and we'll help you create it.